Iran and Israel. When you hear those two names, you probably think of one thing: bitter enemies, right? It feels like this conflict has been raging forever, a struggle that's always on the brink of exploding into a massive war. It seems like it's always been this way, and it always will be this way. But what if I told you that entire picture is completely wrong?
Yeah, let's really dig into this because the real history between Iran and Israel is honestly one of the most shocking and misunderstood stories out there. It really makes you question everything you thought you knew. So let's start with that big question. Were they really enemies forever?
The answer is a flat-out no. I mean, it's almost impossible to believe now, but there was a time, not that long ago, when Israel's tanks were literally running on Iranian oil. And Iran's own security was being bolstered by Israeli weapons. You had their two powerful secret agencies, Mossad and Savak, working hand in glove like brothers. They weren't just friendly, they were secret, strategic allies. So the real mystery is, what on earth happened? How did that deep friendship totally collapse and turn into one of the most dangerous rivalries on the planet?
Okay, so to get our heads around this, we need to rewind the clock. We're going back to the 1950s. And what's really interesting is that the story doesn't actually start in Tehran or Tel Aviv. Nope, it starts in Cairo, Egypt, with the rise of this incredibly powerful new force that was about to shake up the entire Middle East.
And that force was something called pan-Arab nationalism, spearheaded by Egypt's super charismatic president Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, his big dream was to unite all the Arab countries into one massive superpower, and you could see how that would be a huge threat to the Jewish state of Israel, right? But here's the twist. It was also a threat to Iran. Why? Because Iran is a powerful Muslim nation, sure, but it's not Arab, it's Persian. And you know how the old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
So this wasn't just some vague idea. It actually became a formal strategy for Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. He called it the periphery doctrine. And the logic was really pretty simple and kind of brilliant. He thought, okay, if all of my immediate Arab neighbors hate me, what do? Well, you just leapfrog them. You bypass them and make friends with their neighbors, the non-Arab countries on the edge or the periphery of the Middle East. We're talking about places like Turkey, Ethiopia, and you guessed it, the biggest prize of all, Iran.
And just like that, a new relationship was born. But it wasn't like a formal treaty with handshakes and photographers. No, it was much more like a secret affair. You see, the Shah of Iran, he was personally very friendly with Israel, but he was also terrified of what his own people would think. So the whole thing was kept super quiet, behind a very, very deep curtain of secrecy. But what they managed to build together in the shadows, well, it was nothing short of extraordinary.
So let's break down what this secret deal actually looked like. It was a perfect give and take. On one side, you have Israel. They desperately needed oil, and of course, their Arab neighbors weren't about to sell them any. So who steps in? Iran. They even built a secret pipeline together, running from the Red Sea all the way to the Mediterranean, just to get around to Egypt. Think about this. At its peak, a whopping 90% of all the oil Israel used came from Iran. And in return, Israel gave the Shah the one thing he craved more than anything else: security. Israel's legendary Mossad trained the Shah's feared secret police, the Savak. They taught them everything they knew, including some brutal interrogation techniques to crush anyone who spoke out against the regime, and, ultimately, to keep the Shah on his throne.
But it gets even crazier. The absolute peak of their cooperation, this was a secret so big, so dangerous, that even their biggest ally, the United States, was kept completely in the dark. It was called Project Flower. And it was a billion-dollar joint project to build a ballistic missile, one that could carry a nuclear warhead. I mean, you had Israeli engineers physically on the ground in Iran building a missile factory, and the Shah was bankrolling the whole thing with hundreds of millions of dollars in oil money.
So you can see the picture, right? These two non-Arab powers working together in secret, basically planning to dominate the Middle East. It looked like nothing could stop them. But a storm was brewing, a massive historical storm right on the streets of Tehran. And in 1979, that storm was about to hit and wash everything they had built completely away.
And the timing, the irony here is just staggering. In 1978, you had Iranian and Israeli generals literally popping champagne celebrating their first successful missile test from Project Flower. At that exact moment, they were totally blind to the revolution that was exploding in the streets, a revolution that was about to bring the whole house down. Just a few months later, by February 1979, it was all over. The Shah had fled the country, the revolution had won, and that decades-long secret friendship was shattered in an instant.
Because the new guy in charge, Ayatollah Khamenei, had a worldview that was the polar opposite of the Shah's. The Shah saw himself as a modern Persian king, a friend of the West. Khomeini, he saw himself as the leader of a global Islamic revolution. And in his mind, if you wanted to lead the Islamic world, there was one non-negotiable requirement. You had to be the biggest enemy of Israel. He didn't waste any time making his agenda crystal clear, famously calling America the Great Satan and Israel the Little Satan.
And if you want one image that just perfectly captures this seismic shift, this is it. In what has to be one of the most powerful symbolic gestures of the last century, Khomeini took the keys to the building that had been Israel's unofficial embassy in Tehran, and he personally handed them over to Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO. Just think about that. The building that was Israel's main hub one day was the official Palestinian embassy the next. The message couldn't be clearer. The friendship was over. It was dead.
So you'd think that's the end of the story, right? Friendship over, new era of hatred begins. But this is where things get even weirder. The alliance was definitely gone, replaced by very public hostility. But behind the curtain, the messy world of geopolitics was about to throw another absolutely bizarre curveball.
Okay, get this. In 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invades Iran. Khomeini's new revolutionary government is shaky. They're desperate for weapons just to survive. Now, who is the one country that not only hated Saddam Hussein, but also had all the spare American-made weapon parts that Iran's military needed? You guessed it, Israel. So picture this scene. While crowds in Tehran are chanting death to Israel, Israeli planes are secretly landing in Iran at night, delivering plane loads of weapons in something called Operation Seashell. This wasn't about friendship. This was cold, hard pragmatism. Israel was simply more afraid of a powerful, potentially nuclear Iraq than it was of a weakened Iran.
But as soon as that Iran-Iraq war was over, that brief marriage of convenience ended. The gloves came all the way off, and the long, deadly shadow war began. Iran knew it couldn't take on Israel directly, so it got creative. It built a ring of fire around Israel using proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, right on Israel's border. And Israel's response? It took the fight deep inside Iran's own territory, pulling off these insane covert operations. I mean, in 2018, Mossad agents somehow managed to steal Iran's entire secret nuclear archive from a warehouse in Tehran. And then in 2020, they assassinated Iran's top nuclear scientist using a robotic sniper, controlled by satellite. It's like something out of a spy movie.
So, for decades, this is how they fought. A war in the shadows, fought by spies and proxies. And both sides, they kind of followed a set of unwritten rules. You know, we can do this, but we can't do that. All to avoid a full-blown, catastrophic war. But very recently, all of those rules have been completely shattered.
The best way to think about it is like a ladder of escalation. For years and years, they stayed on the bottom couple of rungs. You know, fighting through proxies, doing some covert ops. Then they cautiously climbed up a rung to limited strikes, hitting each other's assets in places like Syria. But then in 2024, they threw caution to the wind and jumped all the way to the top, most terrifying rung, direct attack.
So what was the trigger? What pushed them over the edge? It was an Israeli airstrike on an Iranian consulate building in Damascus, Syria. Now, this is really important. Under international law, a country's consulate is considered its own sovereign territory. So in Iran's eyes, this wasn't just an attack in Syria, it was a direct attack on Iran itself. A massive red line had just been crossed.
And Iran's response was something we had never seen before. On April 13, 2024, for the very first time since the revolution 45 years ago, Iran launched a direct attack on Israel from its own territory. We're talking more than 300 drones and ballistic missiles flying through the sky, all headed for Israel.
Now, you can argue all day about whether the attack was a military success or failure, but honestly, that almost misses the point. The real impact was psychological. This was Iran screaming to the world, the old rules are gone. We're done fighting in the shadows. The war was officially out in the open. So think about this incredible journey. From secret partners so close they were building nuclear-capable missiles together to open enemies staring each other down right on the brink of an all-out war. It is one of the most stunning reversals in modern history, and it's a story that has completely shaped the Middle East that we know today. And it leaves all of us with one huge, unsettling question. What on earth will the next chapter hold?